Towards the end of October 1941, we withdrew to defensive positions to consolidate our lines. Reconnaissance units were deployed to keep an eye on the antics of the Russians, who, we suspected, were about to throw themselves into a determined counterattack. No. 4 Company set up their machine guns on the side of a hill and adjusted the ranging gear on their gun mounts to define the killing zone, but, being dangerously far apart, they left large gaps left in our defences. My own little home for this period, which proved to be about 3 weeks, was a trench about 1/2 metre wide and 1.5 metres long. It rained heavily and frequently, so, to create a little bunker, I went into the nearby town to pick up an old door to cover the hard-won slit in the cold earth. To complete the construction, I piled waste soil on top of the door, leaving only a tiny opening beside which I placed my telephone and 4 stick grenades. I spent most of the time alone, sheltering from the rain. Life wasn't exactly comfortable inside my tiny burrow, but I managed. One afternoon, a prolonged Russian artillery barrage broke the peace in my little nest. It was a strange sensation, crouching alone in a cold hole in the ground so far from home, knowing that if fate saw fit, a shell would rip my body to shreds in a searing flash of light. Worse still was the prospect of some horrific injury, or simply being wounded badly enough to prevent escape if we were overrun by the Russians who, I now knew, had many ingenious ways to kill a member of the Waffen-SS. I waited, eyes stretched wide in fearful anticipation until the artillery barrage came to a stuttering end. The approaching battle cry of Russian infantry broke the brief silence, and the air buzzed with bullets from rifles and machine guns. Mortar grenades exploded with dull thumps all around. My fingers tightened on my rifle as I prepared to step into the short section of open trench at the entrance of my bunker. Without warning, there was an almighty boom. I came to my senses in total darkness and absolute silence. The thought came to me that I might be dead, doomed to spend eternity in a world that contained nothing but my lonely soul. Frantically, I clawed at the earth at where I thought the entrance had been. A chink of light showed, and soon the hole was large enough to poke my head through. Gradually, the zipping sound made by bullets flying low over our trenches came back into focus. A voice called, "Irwin? Irwin, are you wounded?" Half dazed, I looked around to see the crew of a nearby machine gun crew wave their hands. "No," I replied. They laughed. I cleared the debris from the entrance of my bunker and found a crater where only seconds before my stick grenades had lain. A bullet or piece of flying shrapnel must have hit them, causing the detonation that would have killed me if I had stepped out only a second sooner. There was no sign of my telephone. Once more, my guardian angel had kept me from harm. "We thought you were a goner, Irwin," called a comrade from the machine gun crew. I waved to show him that I was still in the land of the living. Now the battle really started. As usual, the Russian infantry threw themselves into the killing fields of our machine guns, their wounded and dead piling on top of each other. It was a senseless way to attack, and the Russian soldiers paid a horrifying price for the suicidal tactics of their commanders. Still they pushed across the muddy field, tripping over their dead, standing on their wounded. The attack was petering out. Our guns fell silent. We were ordered to fix bayonets, an order usually only given for the clearing of towns where hand-to-hand combat was expected, but the Russians put their hands in the air and yelled, "The war is finished!" As the prisoners passed, I left the shelter of my foxhole to get a closer look at them. There was panic etched on their faces as they realized they had surrendered to a Waffen-SS unit. No doubt they had succumbed to their government's propaganda leaflets and feared they would be shot out of hand by their captors. Mostly the prisoners kept their eyes directed to the ground, but I caught the eye of one of them and made what I hoped was a friendly gesture, a light wave of my hand. The Russian, a tall, sturdy man with high cheekbones, nodded ruefully as he approached. His hands dug into his pockets, then he shook his massive head as he showed me his empty palms. I pointed to his cap. Without a word, he took it from his head and ripped off the badge with the Soviet star. He handed it to me with a wry smile that exposed the gaps where his front teeth should have been, then joined his comrades. As he shrank into the distance, he turned to look back. I gave a farewell wave of my hand, which he returned. I still have that badge. It shares the same cardboard box as my wound badge and Iron Cross. On reflection, it was careless of me to accept that gift. If captured with the Russian cap badge in my possession, it may well have provoked my captors to inflict worse than usual tortures. Still, in moments of reminiscence, when I take the badge from its box, my thoughts return to that day, and the hope rises in my heart that somehow the Russian managed to rejoin his family. Black mud slurped on every footstep. Ice-cold arrows of rain drummed on our steel helmets, throwing up halos of spray. We came to the edge of a field overlooking a dismal, dilapidated village with an indecipherable name, waiting for the return of a 6-man reconnaissance troop. A veil of drips cascaded from the rim of my helmet. Our platoon leader was becoming anxious and peered into the gloom with binoculars. Verdammt. He cursed. I can't see clearly in this rain. Hold fire? His order was unnecessary. None of us would have opened fire without his command. 200 meters from our position, figures emerged from a stand of scrubby bushes. One of them waved both arms 3 times, paused, then waved another twice. That's them, announced the platoon leader, lowering his binoculars. The spy troop reached our lines. As they passed, they cursed the rain. Kameraden, said one of them, we'll have to fight for our beds tonight. My Kompania-Trupp joined an infantry unit to bolster its strength for the attack. With house-to-house combat looming, we snapped our bayonets onto our rifles. As we entered the village, Russian machine gun fire claimed a few of our Kameraden. I took cover in a doorway. Bullets turned the stonework around the entrance to dust. A ricochet whirred like wings of a hummingbird before smacking against the wall close to my face. Our MG-34s returned fire. There was a muffled explosion. The machine gun noise from both sides came to an abrupt halt. I risked a quick look around the corner of my refuge and saw smoke coming from a window of a house 50 meters deeper into the village. One of our men had managed to get close enough to toss in a stick grenade. Street by street we battled in the cold, lashing rain until we captured the village. Before we had time to set up an effective perimeter, the Russians mounted a vigorous counterattack, forcing us to retreat. We regrouped and pushed forward once more to retake the lost ground, with individual houses changing hands several times. By evening, we had driven the Russians out for the final time. Our compagnie had taken only light casualties, fewer than might have been expected in such a situation. With just 4 of us occupying the front room of a house on a street corner, the only one occupied by Germans within 100 meters, we were in a vulnerable position. Nevertheless, after an exhausting day, it was a relief to get out of the rain that still pattered against any window pane left intact. A chaise longue with tattered red upholstery, the only furniture in the room, stood against the wall opposite the only window. In a fleeting moment of pleasure, we sat on it to enjoy our damp bread and cold sausage, all 100 grams of it, before settling down for the night in uniforms that reeked of mould. The rain had at last relented when I took the over-the-watch from Boris, a Romanian of German descent, whose fluency in Russian had earned him the task of unofficial Kompania interpreter. Beyond my vantage point at the window, floods of silvery light splashed across the wet street as the moon found gaps in the dashing clouds. Boris slumped into a heap in a corner of the room beside our 2 sleeping Kameraden and immediately began to snore. I leaned my rifle against the wall and tried to ignore the rumbles of complaint from my disappointed stomach. After struggling to keep my weary eyes open for an hour, the faint rise and fall of voices on the chill night breeze startled me into full wakefulness. I peered around the edge of the window. Were the voices louder? Were they some sort of auditory hallucination brought on by fatigue and hunger? Were they Russian voices? I listened intently. My blood ran as cold as the rods of rain that had plagued the day. Hardly daring to breathe, I grabbed my rifle. "Erwin," said Boris in a whisper. "What is it? I thought I heard voices." Without taking my eyes from the glistening moonlit street, I replied, "Russians, 12 of them, coming this way." My finger hovered over the trigger of my rifle as the enemy soldiers stopped directly outside the window. Armed with submachine guns, they were certain to storm the house if they spotted me. With only rifles and grenades for protection, we would easily have been overrun. I held my breath and drew back into the deep shadows while keeping the enemy within sight. An argument in subdued voices broke out amongst the Russians, with one soldier vigorously stabbing his finger in the direction from which they had just come. They were lost. Suddenly they fell silent. Someone was calling from farther up the street. Muted laughter broke out. A comrade slapped the back of the soldier who had led the way as they wandered out of view. I lowered my rifle and took a deep breath, the first for several minutes, though it seemed like an eternity. The creaking of a window from the back room of the house grabbed my attention. Regenbogen. It was the correct password, in Boris's unmistakable voice. In the excitement, I had not noticed him leave. He came into the front room with a smile on his face. "Irvin, did you hear their officer call them back?" "Yes, it was lucky for us," I replied. Boris chuckled. "That was no Russian, it was me. Now you owe me an hour's watch." Our two sleeping kameraden wakened, unaware of the peril that had stalked the streets just a few meters from our refuge. Night frosts hardened the mud. With our vehicles now able to move freely over the undulating countryside, Rostov, gateway to the oil fields of the Caucasus, was within our grasp. At 3 a.m. on the 17th of November, a blanket of chill mist deadened every sound, deepened the darkness. At 6 a.m., Hauptsturmführer von Westerhagen addressed the troops. "It will be no easy task. Expect a hard battle. Refrain from eating in case of stomach wounds." It was a warning we had heard countless times before. Shortly after first light, the mist lifted like a curtain to reveal the theatre of combat. The infantry of 1 and 2 Company, supported by the mortars and machine guns of No. 4 Company and a squadron of Sturmgeschütze, led the assault. Tanks with the white painted letter G on their armour, they were from Heeresgruppe Guderian, took up position some distance behind No. 4 Company. They fired off a few rounds but made no effort to advance. Our Sturmgeschütze showed no such hesitation and followed the forward infantry units into the thick of the fighting. We paused in a deep anti-tank ditch to wait for further orders. These ditches, with their steep sloping sides, posed a dangerous obstacle for tanks. With no space to turn, a reversing tank caught in one of these traps would have its gun point harmlessly to the ground. Naturally, every tank crew wished to avoid such a vulnerable predicament, and the Guderian tanks pulled back to safety. In the meantime, men from our Pioneer Corps found mines by the hundred. They quickly cleared the area and built an earthen bridge over the ditch for our Sturmgeschütze to cross. With the roofs of Rostov in sight, we were surprised our tanks did not follow on immediately. Nevertheless, we continued with our plan to push forward for 10 kilometers before digging in to await our next orders, but the enemy, surprised by the vigor of our advance, retreated at speed. Our plan to dig in abandoned, we chased after them to deny them time to create new defensive positions. By the time we reached the outskirts of Rostov, we were isolated from our main army group with no radio or telephone contact. Sepp Dietrich, our divisional commander, sent 2 motorcyclists by separate routes to re-establish contact with our command post and relay the news that we intended to pursue the Russians as far as the River Don, where 2 bridges, a steel rail bridge and a timber bridge carrying the roadway, ran side by side. We soon secured the rail bridge, but lacking ammunition, were unable to prevent a large body of Russians making good their escape across the timber bridge in well-organized columns, a matter we would come to regret in the coming days. When the tanks of Heeresgruppe Guderian finally appeared in Rostov, I heard a Leibstandarte officer remonstrate with a Wehrmacht tank commander. "Where the hell did you get to?" "Oh, we don't follow infantry units until the crossings over anti-tank ditches are secure," he replied. Shortly after entering Rostov, I was in the company of a few Kameraden, among them an Unterscharführer by the name of Hahn. We were wandering near a street junction exchanging news of who had survived and who had fallen. As we passed close to a high timber fence skirting one side of the street, a gate, almost indistinguishable from the fence itself, snapped open from the other side. Unterscharführer Hahn called out, "Achtung!" I caught a glimpse of a Russian officer in a long brown leather coat. He let loose a few rounds from a revolver. Hahn groaned as he doubled up. Before I had time to react, the Russian slammed the gate shut. Clasping his stomach, Hahn grunted, "After the bastard," Heedless of what might be on the other side, we crashed through the gate to give chase, but the Russian managed to make good his escape without us being able to fire off a single shot. We returned to find Usha Khan face down on the ground. I rushed over to kneel beside him, ready to apply a field dressing. When I turned him onto his back, it was clear that it was already too late to save him. Blood drenched the uniform around his abdomen. I stayed there for a moment, helplessly watching the last movements of his lips, thinking how suddenly the end might come for any one of us in that God-forsaken town. "Here, cover him with this," said a camarade, holding out his tent tarpaulin. "We can't just leave him here in the middle of the road," I protested. "We'll drag him over to the fence. Someone will find him and bury him later," was the reply. Later that day, an Untersturmführer caught up with me as I reeled out a telephone cable to a machine gun crew that had set up shop near the railway station. "Report to the field hospital and ask to see Han's body after you've laid the line to the machine guns. It's just a formality, but given the circumstances, we need to make sure of the identity of the body," he explained. The machine gun crew was easy to find. They were firing on a Russian train with heavily armoured locomotives, front and rear, each belching out clouds of steam that seemed too dense to hang in the cold air. Bullets sparked yellow as they ricocheted without effect from the armour plating on the lead locomotive, but the unexpected impact of a shell brought the train to a screeching halt. A second shell hit a goods wagon behind the locomotive, smashing its timber walls to matchsticks. From their vantage point on a hill, the crew of an 8.8-centimetre flak cannon were having fun, tormenting the train as a cat would torment a mouse, pummeling it to scrap with shell after shell. The doors of the two passenger carriages to the rear of the train swung open. Among the figures leaping to the ground were women and children. "Scheisse, it's packed with civilians," groaned the machine gunner, who instinctively stopped firing. "Why the fuck didn't they get out the other side?" I hissed, as shells continued to whistle down on the scattering civilians, ripping to shreds the fine line that distinguishes honour from barbarity. Nowadays, such incidents are euphemistically reported as collateral damage. "The flak crew can't see them from that distance. It's a bloody massacre," snapped the machine gunner. When the firing stopped, Company Commander Krotzer arrived by car, and I helped him search the bodies scattered on the grimy tracks. I learned later that the documents we recovered showed the occupants of the carriages had been commissars and high-ranking officials hoping to escape with their families. With my gruesome task complete, I returned to the field hospital to identify Unterscharführer Han's body. One of our tanks had broken through the fence and run over his head, which was now as flat as a pancake. Curiously, he was still easily recognizable with an almost comical expression on his squashed face. I straightened my uniform before stepping into Battalion Commander Fritz Witt's office. Bully, Witt's German shepherd, lay in a corner, its big brown eyes following my every movement. 4 lesser officers listened avidly as Witt pointed out a position on a map spread over a large table. "Sturmbannführer," I announced with a click of my heels and a smart salute, Schütze Bartmann reporting as ordered. Wearing his Knight's Cross, the immaculately uniformed Sturmbannführer Witt turned his attention from the map. "Ah, Schütze Bartmann, let me show you something," he said with a little beckoning motion of his head. The 4 lesser officers paid little heed to my presence as I followed the Sturmbannführer to a window overlooking the 2 bridges crossing the River Don. "Obersturmführer Springer's company are engaged in an attempt to form a bridgehead on the opposite bank," explained the Sturmbannführer, "but as yet we have no means of communicating with them. You, Schütze Bartmann, will remedy that failing." "Jawohl, Sturmbannführer," I replied. "Since there is no radio contact with No. 4 Company, I am entrusting you with the task of laying a telephone line across the bridge." Returning to the table, he spoke to one of the officers, an Untersturmführer. "Fetch a few bottles of Sekt 1 each for everyone in the room." He turned to me briefly and said, "Schütze Bartmann, just bear with us a few moments." There must have been a good supply of Sekt nearby, because it didn't take long for the Untersturmführer to return, clasping 5 bottles by their necks, 3 in one hand and 2 in the other. The thought ran through my mind that the Untersturmführer had practiced this before. Not wishing to distract from the celebrations, I quietly took up a position near the corner of the room and stood at attention to await further instructions. Corks popped. Champagne glasses filled to the brim with sparkling sect chinked merrily. A toast celebrated the fall of Rostov, 1,000 kilometers inside enemy territory. Fritz Witt looked over his shoulder. "Schütze Bartmann, where's your bottle?" "Sturmbannführer, I don't have one," I replied stoically. Witt turned on the unfortunate Untersturmführer and bellowed, "When I say fetch a bottle for everyone in the room, that means everyone." As the red-faced Untersturmführer scuttled out of the office, Fritz Witt waved for me to approach, whereupon he gave me his own bottle and glass. "We'll just wait a moment or two for the Untersturmführer to return with an extra bottle so that we can all celebrate our success," he said. Still grinning from ear to ear, I made the connections at the station-end telephone and began to reel out the cable across the rail bridge. When I was midway across the first of the great steel latticework spans, I heard Sturmbannführer Witt shout at the top of his voice from the open window of his office. "Schütze Bartmann, do not cross the bridge. Return at once." Less than an hour after drinking my glass of sect, I was with a machine gun crew guarding the approaches to the station, when a handful of survivors from Springer's 3 Company ran over the bridge towards us. The chief of the machine gun crew grabbed the first man to make it back to our side. "Where's Obersturmführer Springer?" "Right behind. We were trapped. In the signals building," panted the rifleman, his breath instantly condensing into a white cloud around his face. "Upstairs, 6 of us. Oberst Springer got us out, tossed a couple of grenades down the stairs. We're all that's left of the company." I realized then that Fritz Witt had probably saved my life. From his viewpoint in the station, he had seen the Russian attack on the signals building unfold and had called me back. Acts of bravery by officers such as Obersturmführer Springer inspired the ordinary soldier to give of his best. Springer had stayed in the signals building with a few dedicated Kameraden until the last possible moment. There was no place for the Druckerberger in the Leibstandarte, no place for officers who were shirkers that sent the men under their command into perilous situations while they mused over their military successes in the safety of some comfortable billet. Shortly after this action, Obersturmführer Springer was deservedly awarded the Knight's Cross. Like hungry swine summoned by the rattle of the stick on the swill bucket, the SS security service, the Sicherheitsdienst, arrived the day after we secured Rostov. As far as the locals were concerned, there was little to distinguish them from members of the Leibstandarte, apart from the letters D sewn onto a lozenge-shaped patch on their tunics. With vindictive dynamism, they quickly alienated the civilian population by plundering their livestock and searching out Jews. There was a characteristic manner in these people, a certain air, a subliminal smell that warned they were invulnerable to the natural instincts of man and unassailable by pity. In their hands, they held the power of death over life. Though we had not eaten properly for days, none of us dared barter for even a chicken with the local peasants, while the SD lurked in the background. Shortly after the arrival of the SD, I had just delivered a message to the command post of another company. I came across a Leibstandarte Schütze sitting on the steps at the entrance to a building. When I asked him why he was sitting alone in the cold, he looked up at me with yellowed eyes and with a blank expression on his face, silently shook his head. The reek of stale alcohol caught the back of my nose. I went on my way, wondering why the drunkard had not already been arrested. Later that day I discovered that the SD had commandeered several men from that company to assist them in tracking down the local Jews. Perhaps the drunken soldier was one of those men? I shall never know for sure. But as far as I am aware, this is the only occasion when the SD called upon members of the Leibstandarte to help them perform their dirty work. During the last days of November 1941, the Russian winter set in with a vengeance. The fleeing Russians had cleared out the shops, and with our supply lines overstretched, food was in short supply. To keep the fuel in the trucks from freezing, the drivers shunted them back and forth until fuel became precious. Then they lit fires beneath them. By chance, a driver from another platoon told us of a food depot not far from the rail station. At full speed we drove to the storage facility, miraculously missed by the SD, to find metal canisters filled with butter and honey, tins of frozen eggs and some ham and schmaltz, a kind of lard made from the fat found around the intestines of cattle. Delicious. With our booty covering the floor of our truck, I sat uncomfortably on a canister of butter, its metal rim digging into the back of my thighs. As we tackled a steep hill on the return journey, a few of the canisters rolled from the rear of the truck and bounced off into the distance, but at least this created a little more floor space. Our overextended supply lines had left us short of supplies of all kinds, but having secured a good supply of food, our most pressing need was for ammunition. Russian troops now ran across the timber bridge to our side of the river in organized groups, without us firing more than a token shot or two to keep them on their toes. With the Sea of Azov at our backs, we were in a vulnerable position. Now was blowing in from the east when word passed round that we were to pull back to a defensive position north of Taganrog. For the first time I sensed an air of subdued panic in the bearing of our commanders. We had no previous failures from which to learn, since retreat was a skill we had neither planned for nor contemplated. In effect, it was every man for himself and something of a shambles. In a flurry of swirling snowflakes, our Kompanietrupp piled into the back of our truck, each man finding a place amongst the barrels of food we had picked up earlier. By the time we left Rostov, we had caught up with the rearmost vehicles in the escaping column. Close to Chaltir, a town to the west of Rostov, we glimpsed a squadron of fast-moving Russian tanks in the distance. "The bastards are trying to cut us off," said Boris, our Romanian camarade, who had saved my skin with his impression of a Russian officer a few weeks earlier. "Who's in charge of the rearguard?" asked a figure sheltering behind the cabinet where our company maps were stored, just behind the driver's cab nittle, answered Boris. "If he doesn't do something." The truck juddered as its engine coughed and died. The fresh snow creaked under the wheels as we drifted to a standstill. In abject silence we looked at each other, none of us daring to speculate on what might happen next. The cab door slammed. A few of us shuffled to the side of the truck, straining our necks like inquisitive monkeys to watch the driver, who appeared with a heavy wrench in his hand. "The fuel must be frozen," he said, looking up at his staring audience. He bent his body like an arthritic old man and tapped the fuel tank with his wrench. "Listen to that echo," he said. "The diesel in the tank's still liquid. It's the fuel line that's frozen. Scheisse, the Russians are chasing our asses and there's no time to light a fire," someone groaned. "I have an idea," offered Boris. "Do you have a length of hose?" "Naja," said the driver, "but it's not long enough to stretch from the fuel tank to the engine." "And a funnel?" "Of course." Boris turned to us and made gathering gestures. "Gas mask canisters, water bottles, quickly. Anything that will hold fuel." He passed the containers over the side to the driver. "Here, siphon fuel into them, and hurry." With Boris now at his side, the driver inserted the rubber tube into the fuel tank. He put his mouth to the tube, then spat diesel onto the snow. "My lips are frozen. I can't feel if I'm sucking or blowing." Boris grabbed the tube from the driver. "Get back behind the wheel." When he had filled the containers, Boris passed them into the cab, and rubber hose in hand disappeared round the front of the truck. Moments later, he returned to the driver's door with one end of the tube in his gloved hand and thrust it through the open window of the cab. "I've attached the other end to the fuel line near the engine. Push the funnel into this end. I'll pour in the fuel as we drive." The door on the passenger side of the cab slammed. At last, Boris was in the cab, beside the driver. We returned to our seats on the barrels of food rescued from Rostov. "I just hope the battery doesn't let us down," said a camarade. "That's tempting fate, Dummkopf," I snapped angrily. The truck swayed a little on its springs as the starter motor laboriously turned the cold engine. Our eyes, tense and unblinking, stared at each other in hope. The engine grunted and coughed agonizingly before springing into its familiar throaty snarl. Dismay turned to joy, and we cheered as we picked up speed. The inescapable apprehension one feels when death is a constant threat grinds on the nerves, strains them to breaking point. Hours of duty in bitter temperatures drives the lifeblood from the limbs. Frigid air hacks relentlessly and without mercy at the face and hands. The chronic lack of sleep saps the body's energy reserves, allowing exhaustion to set its pernicious roots into every cell of the body. In such conditions, sleep can overcome the unwary to bring blessed oblivion or mortal danger, no matter what the circumstances. And so, too cold even to shiver, I tucked the collar of my greatcoat under my helmet to protect my face from the numbingly cold air and slipped into an irresistible slumber. I wakened with a jolt under the silence of unblinking starlight. My greatcoat was stiff, glittering with frost. I listened. Nothing moved. I was alone in the back of the truck, which stood as if abandoned, close to an isolated house. I tried to push myself from between the barrels of food where I had slumped completely oblivious to the discomfort. Both my legs beneath the knees seemed to have turned to wood. Frozen wood. I crawled between the barrels of butter and schmaltz to the rear of the truck, where I hung my useless legs over the tailgate. With a push from both hands, I launched myself from the rear of the truck, but with feet totally without feeling. I was unable to sense their impact with the ground. I lost my balance and fell forward, into the snow. Using my rifle as support, I struggled to my feet and somehow managed to hobble one foot in front of the other, until hardly caring what I would find inside, I pushed open the door of the house. Astonished faces looked up at me. There, sitting in front of a roaring fire with a handful of Russian women, were my kameraden. Stripped to the waist, they nipped lice from the armpits of their shirts, flicking them into the flames, much to the unease of their hosts, who, for reasons I was never able to fathom, seemed to respect these infernal little pests. Full of apologies, they sat me in front of the fire, where I immediately fell once more into a deep sleep. The sky was already light when I wakened. My legs still had the weight of dense wood, but now the wood was on fire. I groaned in agony. One of the women pulled off my boots and socks. The skin of both legs had turned white with underlying purplish blotching. She looked at them and shook her head. A pane in the small window at the front of the house rattled in resonance with our truck's revving engine. I shuffled over to the window and rubbed a peephole in the frost fern on the glass. Before the moisture had time to refreeze, I managed to glimpse my kameraden digging snow from around the truck's wheels. Soon I would have to leave. I returned to a chair close to the still burning fire and, ignoring the throbbing in my legs, pulled on my socks and boots. Boris called from the open door. "We remembered you this time, Erwin. We leave in a few minutes. The driver says you can sit in the cab to keep warm." When the driver, whose name I have long since forgotten, asked about my legs, I described the symptoms. "Mild frostbite," he scoffed. "That's nothing. But if your feet had turned black and fallen off, you might just have got a ticket home." He was, I thought, exaggerating, though, as I later found out, not by much. "I've seen it all," he continued. "Hundreds of cases, some of them terrible." I was shocked to learn that so many of our kameraden had been victims of frostbite. "We should have better winter clothing," I yelled over the engine noise. It was crazy to think the uniforms we wore back home in Berlin would be of any use in the Russian winter. "Haven't you heard the rumours?" I shook my head. "Well, the story goes that the chief quartermaster ordered winter clothing way back in September, but when he opened up the crates he found nothing but desert kit." His voice heavy with irony, he added, "Now how could that happen?" Instantly I came to the same shocking conclusion that I suspect the driver had already made, but had been unwilling to elaborate upon. The arrival of desert kit had not been some kind of incompetent mix-up at the supply depots in Germany, but an act of traitorous sabotage. Somewhere back home, high-ranking officials, secret communists, were determined to sell us out to the Russians. Onwards we pressed until we reached the Mius, a river that flows into a firth that empties into the Sea of Azov. By this time my legs throbbed agonizingly, so I reported immediately to the first aid post, set up in an unheated house to await treatment. As I entered, a scene of horror unfolded before my eyes. A soldier wearing thick felt boots, issued to protect feet when on guard duty, screamed in agony as a doctor tried to pull them from his feet. "These boots are a curse," the doctor said. "They suck in water then freeze. It's not the first time I've had to cut them off." He looked up to the two medical orderlies standing at the end of the table, near the victim's head. "You'd better hold him down." As the doctor cut at the felt boots, their owner suddenly fell silent. "He's lucky he's fainted," said the doctor. I retched as the doctor finally managed to free the first boot. The rotten flesh of the victim's leg ended in a stump of bone, leaving the rest of the foot in the boot. Feeling a little embarrassed that I had troubled the doctor with my relatively trivial frostbite, I rejoined my compagnontrop. Little did I realize the damage to my legs and feet would continue to cause serious problems more than 70 years later. Overlooking the banks of the River Meuse, we came across a small group of Wehrmacht personnel stationed in the open fields, totally without cover. Bone-chilling winds had already carved deep frowns of dejection on their sullen faces. "Start digging," said one of the older guys, an Obergefreiter who looked 50 but was probably nearer 30. He flung a spade to a teenager who stood motionless, hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. The spade clanged as it struck a patch of stone-hard ice. Eyes streaming with tears brought on by the pitiless icy-cold wind, the teenager looked at the spade and smirked ironically. "The ground's frozen. How can I dig?" "You'll change your mind when the shells start raining down on you." The teenager sullenly picked up the spade and half-heartedly prodded the ground with it. "I can't dig this," he said, flinging the spade to the side. An argument was brewing. The rest of the Wehrmacht men looked on, hoping, no doubt, that the excitement might distract their attention from the plummeting temperatures. Or better, that some officer would come along to tell them a comfortable billet had been fixed up for the night. What a bunch. There were never such discipline problems in the Leibstandarte. In contrast to the Wehrmacht, most of our Kameraden were about the same age, and our leaders, although often only 10 years or so older than the men under their command, displayed excellent leadership abilities. This was a great advantage to us when things got difficult. We pulled together to overcome problems as best we could. Digging a trench was undoubtedly an onerous task in the Russian winter. Ice formed beads on our eyelashes as we dug. Our feet froze in the same boots we had used to march around Plattfuss Alley the previous summer. Fresh snow filled the trenches as we dug. To add to our troubles, enormous boulders lurked under the surface, so that a promising Trench 1, after hacking through a layer of frozen mud, often had to be abandoned. Intoxicated by the fantasy of our ultimate victory, the Endsieg, the men of the Leibstandarte shouldered these hardships without complaint. From our position, we looked across a frozen meadow to the Russians on other side of the river with some envy. They occupied the edge of a forest where they had prepared proper shelters to protect themselves from the penetrating cold. Fortunately, the supply lines to our new position were well established, and we had an abundance of ammunition, so we fired on Ivan from time to time, just to liven things up a little. As a respite from our miserable life in the exposed trenches, during which frostbite claimed several victims from our company, we sometimes took to the deep caves found in the area. Although they offered protection from the cutting wind, a heavy, immutable chill that gnawed at the bones haunted them. Somehow they brought to mind the frightening fairy tales told to me as a child. The Russians must have had the same idea, because it was possible on occasion to hear their voices percolating through interlinking voids in the rock, a matter that made it difficult for us to relax completely.